So Jan, just to warn you, I like to go high-low. So we're going to sort of zoom out and go high altitude, sort of 25,000 feet, think about things strategically, and then we'll pretty much, dive down safely to low, meaning, closer to the ground or if not on the ground, and sort of get tactical. And we'll sort of bounce between those two altitudes over the next hour, just to kind of give you a heads up. So let's start high, at a higher altitude. Actually, no, let's go low first, and then we'll connect it to high. How much of your search volume have you replaced ChatGPT or with ChatGPT or Claude versus Google? What's sort of happened to
Yeah, yeah.
your
Well,
personal search habits?
uh, totally. So, I mean, right now, what I use Google for is for lookup. If I know that something, if I want to get to a website, I want to get to a paper, I know the title. Google does a great job of getting in the first result. Perfect. There's not really a whole lot of discussion or thinking involved. Just get me what I want. But if I have anything that's more difficult than that, like I want to understand something or I have a question as to what something is, I will definitely use Perplexity or I'll use ChatGPT because they provide, the answer much more rapidly, right? They process all the data that's out there and they get you the information you want. Now you have to filter that because it's not always 100% reliable, for sure. But otherwise you'd be left on your own. You do the same query on Google, they get some web pages. Who knows what the authenticity of these web pages are? You'd have to spend a lot of time reading through it, et cetera, et cetera. It's just very time consuming, in my opinion. So there's a huge accelerator in being able to get to that answer more quickly. So, yeah.
Okay, but back to my question. Just come up with a number. What percentage, if you had to guess, like what
Yeah, I'd say 50% or so.
50% has
Yeah,
switched,
it's lookup queries are actually really common. So, they're kind of like their head queries, right? So I do a lot of it and I'm not even aware of it. And it's not something that Google monetizes because, it's just looking something up. The ones that are more important and the ones which are more significant from a productivity perspective are the ones that require thought. And those are the ones I don't use Google for, right?
So if you were running search at Google, or just put yourself in their shoes, like, are they panicking? Are they seeing enough loss?
Yeah, well, they
Are they
have,
seing enough loss of search volume
yeah.
and therefore revenue that they think that they're, that this cow they've been milking for 20 years is,
Yeah.
what's your
I
sense of the mindset in there?
I suspect that there is a certain amount, not exactly panic, but concern. And the answer it's because the chat interface for information finding is just more compelling. It just works better, right? And there you have this enormous, product gradient in favor of a kind of a more modern interface that's just smarter. Now, as a search engine, you could try to introduce that into your own technology, as Google and Bing have. But they have this, business model problem, which is that, the chat interface is actually quite expensive to produce and it doesn't monetize. So it undercuts your business model. And, and the companies in a situation like that are reluctant to introduce these things, even though they could. I mean, they know how to do it. They've certainly experimented with it. But now it's all buried, or, Google to have this like AI generated sort of summary, which is sometimes helpful, but they
Right.
miss the essential point, which is kind of the follow-up questions, the conversation, the things that make kind of the AI chatbot so compelling is just not there. Or maybe you can use some alternative interface, but it's well hidden. I mean, that's what the case is for Bing. And that's all about them worried about their business model and therefore,
So classic incumbent's dilemma. I mean, they invented the technology essentially,
yes,
right? So the
yes,
transformer kind of breakthrough 7, 8, I guess maybe 8 years ago now. I mean,
yeah,
you've been not at Google necessarily, or did you work at Google? No, you
I
worked at
never have.
everywhere else, right? Okay,
Yeah, pretty
so
much.
pretty much. Uh, so that conversation, I assume, was all about, yeah, there's no business model, and this thing hallucinates. I want to go back to hallucinations, so remind me if we don't,
Yeah.
if I forget to ask you. So this thing hallucinates, and our brand stands for very high quality if you're Google, right? So yeah, again,
Yeah, but you don't know what the quality of the web pages are that you send up to people, right? It's not like people don't get spammed on Google. They do, right? So it's a
sure.
little bit, you always have to it's always caveat emptor when you're kind of looking at stuff from the web, right? You have to be a little bit skeptical, I think, regardless of what the source is, in my
Sure,
opinion.
but the incumbent dilemma was that, right? Business model, is
Yes.
this really good enough for consumers, good enough for
Yeah.
prime time? And Google's a prime
Well,
time kind of
it is
service.
good enough for prime time, but
Right,
it's not something they want to do because
right.
of costs, I would say, right? I
So
mean, I
when
think,
do they get forced? When is it an erosion of business? Is it erosion of search traffic and consumer sentiment? When does someone say, screw it at Google, let's say, and we just have to move to that model and roll the dice
well,
or not?
if someone can figure out how to, well monetize the chat interface so that they're not going to lose a great deal of money, right? So so instead of trading something which is an incredible cash cow for something which is, 10x more expensive and makes $0, that's not a very compelling, business case, right? So someone could potentially figure out how to make that, monetize it. It hasn't happened yet. Doesn't mean it wouldn't. That I think would, potentially produce a change. In the interim, it just feels like a steady decline, in my opinion, right? Because there's really nothing that's going to
Yeah,
change it.
I get it, but they're sitting on mountains of cash. I mean,
Yes.
at some point, don't they have to kind of like man up and like,
You'd think so, but this isn't the way these companies work because, it's quarter to quarter. They got to make their numbers. Is there an investment case? Is it the case that they're willing to spend, billions of dollars to completely undermine their existing product, which is produces 90% of their revenues? And I don't think I can find a company that's willing to do that.
yeah, that's fair. That's fair. Okay. I want to go to hallucinations. So let's go get a little bit tactical. I can't tell what the hallucination rate is, meaning when I read, I hear and see numbers like 7 or 8%, maybe even double digit percentages, or I see like 2 or 3% in a chart I saw earlier this week. How should we think about hallucination rate? Should we care about the percentage? Is it,
Yeah.
like what's, and you're, again, you're a search guy. You must find hallucinations incredibly
Yeah.
frustrating and really,
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I
what are
mean,
your thoughts?
you get a sense for when you're likely to encounter an hallucination, which is, if you start talking about stuff which is very niche, where, if you talk, I mean, just use your kind of yardstick. If you were talking to an intelligent, colleague or wherever, and you start talking about some topic where you don't really expect them to know what they're talking about, and you
Right.
would take it with like a grain of salt. The same is true for a chat agent, right? I do this all the time. There are a lot of, niche hobbies I have, and sometimes it has the kind of answer you want, but sometimes it's like, not really. It's got 80% correct or something like that. So you have to kind of verify it. Um, it's easy to get frustrated by that because you kind of want, your information to be reliable, and that's fair. But on the other hand, why would your expectation be higher than what you'd get from a normal conversation? It's not clear to me.
Yeah, yeah, a whole sec, but yeah, I agree. Wouldn't you suggest, because I do think humans would say, listen, I'm not sure, I'm going to spitball here, or,
Mhm.
humans might add, some sort of qualification or disclaimer to the answer. Not all.
Yes, yes, right.
I have some good friends, won't
Well,
mention names, that, are prepared to talk about confidently about stuff they know
yes.
not about, they know
Right.
nothing. But why wouldn't OpenAI like serve up a little disclaimer, not at the bottom of every query, which is, check your
Well,
facts, but when it's kind of spitballing or might be hallucinating, why doesn't it say to you, hey, I'm
yeah.
spitballing here?
Well, so if it knew, it should probably do something even better, which is to say, I shouldn't answer that question or something like that. So it suggests
It doesn't know it's
it
spitballing.
doesn't, it doesn't know, right? And
It's confidently bullshitting and doesn't really know.
no, that's my assumption, right? Because, if they did, as a product person, you would definitely use that information, right? And yeah, so it's very much in the category of like, smart person you're talking to who's actually a pretty good BSer, right? As well,
Right. Right.
right?
And so related, and I'm asking all these questions because I can't figure this out, but you should be able to, because you've been in search for the last 30 years
Yeah.
and machine learning. What I hear is this can never be solved. That the current version of the large language model will never get hallucinations to zero.
Well, right.
Is that your
Because
point? Is that your point of
yeah, I
view?
mean, probably because there's always a frontier, right? So it's like there, these, you got to think about these things as like an onion or something like that, where you've got the core where, things are really solid and you can rely on it. And then as you go on, people push the envelope, and they want to go to more and more obscure stuff. And then it starts getting kind of iffy. There's always that frontier, regardless of how good you are. And I think there's an inevitability to that. But it's the same as true as whenever you're assessing information, you want to get sources. You want to get, multiple, people saying the same thing to build your confidence. I mean, this is a fundamental thing about how people, process information. How do you trust what you hear? It's
Mhm.
not so obvious, really. It isn't. Right? And people have a tendency to be far too gullible, I think, in general, right? So you need to be skeptical, but, you need to make progress as well. And this is kind of one of these, fundamental trade-offs, right? It's hard to get away from.
Mhm.
I mean, you can't spend all your time not trusting anything, and you're not going to you're not going to, learn anything, right?
Right.
So there's
No,
some kind of give and take.
so you're saying really this challenge has existed before in all other forms of media and information. It's not that much
Totally.
different. And
No.
so just like proceed with some caution, but proceed,
And,
obviously.
best case scenario, people learn to be a bit skeptical. And that would, I think, would generally speaking be great.
Right,
There's a
sure.
lot of misinformation out there. So if people were a little better at, filtering it out, I think it would be very, very good for society.
What do you personally do? For example, do you cut and paste the same prompt into two AIs just to sort of check both?
Well, no, I mean,
What do you do?
if you use a tool like Perplexity, it gives you sources. So it
Sure.
says, this is the answer. This is what is distilled, but here are the web sources. You can go check it out, which I do sometimes, when, I'm not really sure whether this is reliable, or if there seems like there are multiple, opinions being stated, and it
Mhm.
doesn't quite add up. And I'll chase it down. Um, and those, so it's somewhat rare, but I'll do that. And I think that's a valuable kind of aspect of a tool like Perplexity. ChatGPT does less of that, and that's a
Mhm.
problem, right? I would
Yep.
say. Yeah.
And I want to circle back to the incumbent dilemma because you've been working really most of your career at incumbents, very
Yes.
successful
Yeah.
companies that, kind of have won their category. Just what's your observation about how to break that or, internally, like just riff a bit
Yeah.
on
Well, it's tough. I
as
mean,
leaders, what should
yeah.
we be thinking about? Because we're all gonna, I think, face this at some level from
Yeah.
AI at some point, right?
Right.
It's gonna
Well, I
threaten
mean,
our business model, threaten our user interface, threaten our, our paradigm, whatever you want to say.
if a company is doing well and they're at the top of their game, very hard for them to change what they're doing, because what's the argument exactly? I mean, I would say something just as an example, and I don't want to, ding Walmart. Walmart is a great retailer. It's a great retailer, right? Wonderful business, knows how to do this well. You know, company that's aware that technology and e-commerce is important, but fundamentally it's about stores and about getting the lowest possible price. And it's like, well, why would you change your working way to accommodate something which is, not necessarily going to, maybe it might improve your business, but at the end of the day, certainly not going to change it in the short term, right? So often I think, incumbents struggle with this unless it's a crisis, right? Where, it becomes increasingly clear that whatever business they're in is just tanking, right? And they have a limited amount of time to do something about it. I was at Microsoft when the pivot from being an, OS provider, Windows, to being a cloud provider happened. And that was, fantastic to see close up, because Microsoft is a very large company, very wealthy company. And, for it to consciously, I'll use the word abandon a product line is probably too strong, but, recognize that it was legacy, and then do a heavy investment in a new product line with huge amounts of risks of, across the board product risk, revenue risk, everything, and do that and actually succeed at it is rare, I would
Mhm.
say, right? And I thought that was very impressive. Extremely top down, right? This is what the CEO does, right? So this is strategy. This is grand strategy, right? And, because the people on the front line, have
Yep.
opinions, but they
They
don't
they
have
don't
the,
want they don't want to do this probably, right? Or it's just gonna be it's gonna
well,
be hard
they
and
do,
painful.
but they don't have the influence, right? Because
Yeah,
this is
sure.
a huge risk, right? And
Yep.
people have to be convinced, right? And it's sociological in its dimensions, right? Because you're talking about a big company, you got, potentially 100,000 employees or more. You got to convince people that this is the right thing to do, and in the right way, right? Not in like the Elon Musk way, but in the right way, right?
Sure. Yeah,
The
and
sense of,
I would argue, Jan, that's the same for almost any size company. Harder as you get bigger, obviously, but
yes,
I think, our audience and our students are running, 10, 20 person companies. And I think this sort of this risk that might be posed to them, from AI, from generative AI, is real at some point, if not now already in the next year or two. And this notion of, shedding some of that incumbent status in order to,
yeah, it
again.
requires belief and vision at the top, at the highest level,
Mhm.
and persistence, and qualified risk taking, right? So really understanding the situation, because it's not like you could ever squeeze the risk out of these situations. You cannot,
Hmm.
but you have to work hard to sort of try to minimize it and understand how this really plays into your business. It's, I would say, quite difficult. I'm sure it's one of the most difficult things that businesses can do.
So, okay, I want to, you opened the door, so I want us to walk through it because you talked about Walmart just a little bit, but
Yeah.
let's use them, and we could use Amazon, I think,
Yeah.
equally for this question, which is, yeah, maybe we'll use Amazon because I use Amazon more, and I'm getting more and more frustrated with their product pages, in that just is so much kind of extra junk and data and information, ads, and buy this one time, buy it through subscription. Do you want to get insurance? Like, just to me, it's becoming like a really bad search page, and it should be like a beautiful product page. And I know Amazon was never beautiful in terms of UI, but my question is, why haven't either of these companies and or others started to roll out, or at least in a pilot prototype phase, that chat interface where I just,
Well, I mean,
I tell it what I want and I get one
yeah,
product.
well,
I
you'd
get
think
one
that that
product
would
back.
be a no-brainer in the e-commerce domain. And Amazon does have a chat interface. It's this thing called Rufus, and it's extremely well hidden. It's something, as far as I know, you can actually transact through it. You can only get advice, so product advice.
Hmm.
So again, another example of an incumbent sort of pulling their punch. Again, not because they don't know how to do it, but it just undermines their business model and they don't want to do it. I mean, for Amazon, as with Google, they make a huge amount of money off ads, and they're trying to
Sure.
figure out how to make
So,
ads, work there.
yeah. So if a couple PhDs and a dog came to you, said we're raising money to do an e-commerce startup, and we're going to basically, hide everything behind the UI, so to speak, and present to the consumer this really frictionless experience, would you invest?
Totally. Now, that could be Perplexity, right? Now, Perplexity is, showing this kind of, generic search interface, but they're searching for a business model. And to me, it seems like the natural one. E-commerce is a wonderful property that every query, every information read is monetized because ultimately it leads to a transaction, right?
Hmm.
And there's a revenue share on transaction. So, it's actually a really good business model for one of these interfaces. It doesn't carry ads, so it's not as rich as a search page is. It's also, as we discussed when we're talking about Google, not a necessary interface for like product lookup. If you know what you're going to buy,
Hmm.
going to any e-commerce site and just saying what it is you want to buy will work, and you'll get your product and you can do your, comparisons. It's only when you want to do what's referred to as high consideration buying, where you don't know what you want to buy, you don't even know much about the category, you're kind of like looking around and you need information, where typical e-commerce engines fail miserably.
Hmm.
In my opinion, they just don't support it very well, and the
Yeah.
traditional search engine interface doesn't support that, right? Because it's a one shot, give me a question, I'll give you an answer kind of thing, right? Doesn't really have a lot of room for give and take. um, Amazon's probably the best e-commerce site with respect to that particular problem, but even so, it fails, I think, right? And you see this in certain categories like apparel, for example. Apparel is kind of an archetypical, I don't know really what I want to buy kind of category. I'll know it when I see it, maybe,
Hmm.
right? Very tough to do in a e-commerce, realm, right? Because
Right.
it pushes all the weak points.
Travel is another great example, right?
Yeah.
Lots of friction for
Yes.
the consumer in terms of, lots of browser tabs open, Expedia, TripAdvisor, and so on. It would seem in these kinds of use cases, if the search engine, so to speak, is going to return, at least to start, one answer. Obviously, I can get more options, but if it's sort of presented one to me, my trust level has to be off the charts. That the intelligence, the impartiality, like that was a great recommendation for me, I would assume. Would you agree?
Um, yes. Now it kind of depends upon what you are doing. So, e-commerce sites like Amazon, the way that they answer this particular problem is they present the product that has led to the most transactions for a particular query, right?
Hmm.
And that kind of means that a lot of people looked at this and they ended up making a decision. And you probably need to know that because it's probably the best thing, right?
Right,
For
right.
whatever reason, right?
Hmm.
And that actually works pretty well. I mean, it's the wisdom of the crowds. Everyone is, has a vote, and they're just pointing you towards the right thing. And of course, you should assess as to whether it's reasonable or not. But more often than not, it's a good idea. Um, the equivalent thing, and I've done this kind of query on, ChatGPT. It's like, well, I need a tool to do something or other. What are the possibilities? And they'll say, boom, 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 boom. Here are the things you want to do. And I'll say, well, tell me which one is the best. And it'll think about it for a little. Well, this one seems to be the most popular, right? And that's, it's pretty good. It's pretty good information of that sort, right? And
Right.
that's not personalization per se. It's more giving you kind of the aggregate wisdom of everyone who's been, working on something. Personalization would be more, I don't need to say all that much because you understand my needs, and therefore I can be a lot more brief, right? About what I'm talking about, right? As we would in a conversation. That's what true personalization is about. Or, I remember what you did last time. Let's just do it again, kind of things, right? The one-to-one, personalization. Um, and you can get those in chatbots. It's actually relatively easy to do, and chatbots in general have the context. They keep the context of the chat window, so they typically are much better at retaining preference information and knowledge about what you were actually thinking about, going back. And they can use the history that goes back quite far if they want to, right? Because they have that, which
So
is a search engine
right.
doesn't do.
Yeah,
Yeah,
you kind of beat me to it. That's where I wanted to go next, which is how do you remove even more friction? It
yeah,
feels like to me one way to remove more friction is have the AI have this hypothetical search engine know more about me and retain that in memory and then kind of
yeah,
serve
yeah.
me
And
up
I
products
yeah.
and sort of even just watching what I'm doing kind of right.
Well, right. So that's kind of like an extreme form. I don't think anything does that right now. I mean, you can be done within the context of an application.
Mhm.
So, an extreme version of this would be an agent on, say, your phone that you've allowed to observe what you're doing, and so therefore can give well-informed suggestions at any point as to what you might want to do, right?
Mhm.
No such tool exists at the moment, just to be clear, not to freak anyone out. But the question is that would be kind of like a true virtual assistant that is really attuned to what you want to do. I've worked with executive assistants most of my career, and you don't usually get that level of personalization.
So I want that. Like where do you think most consumers are at? Meaning their trade of uh, offering or allowing information to be, hoovered up uh, by the AI, by the co-intelligence, in order to personalize the experience in a more meaningful way. Where do you think most consumers are at
Yeah.
today? What's
Well,
what's
it's
their
it's
what's their trust level even in technology
it's
that they're willing to share that much or have it
yeah.
be,
Well, I mean,
you know?
it's a trade. It's a transaction. It's like, well, I mean, as you would when you just kind of go about the world. If I go to a restaurant frequently, they know me, they recognize me, they can anticipate what I'm likely to order. Maybe it's a more pleasant experience because of that. And I'm okay with that, right? I'm not hiding the fact that I went there. And that's okay for them to know it because I get something back in return, right? A better experience. Um, if I go to a website and I'm, querying on some topic, and then I go to some other website and I get an ad for that other topic that was on a different site, that's something I don't care for. I mean, it's creepy. I didn't give any kind of, I didn't say that it was okay. It's like, well, how did you know that?
Mhm.
And why do you know that? That's going over the line, in my opinion, in
Right.
terms of the quid
It's
pro
it's
quo.
it's jarring for the consumer.
Jarring,
Yeah.
and it's like it's good for them, not good for me particularly, because it's an ad.
Right.
Um, and so I think that you got to look at it from that kind of transactional perspective. Is are you getting something of value in return for the fact that you're giving up your information? And I think consumers in general have that rough sense as to what's fair. Um, and if you can improve my experience, that's great.
Yeah, I feel like AI has an opportunity to kind of break through that sort of those jarring experiences, because it won't be necessarily dropping off at some other website via an ad. It might be inside of that conversation.
Sure.
The conversation in of itself feels more intimate to me, or more of a relationship with, the
Yeah,
AI.
right.
Just
So there's
the
a,
whole paradigm seems
yeah,
better for
yes.
personalization to me.
Right. There's an issue of trust. It's like, when, do you trust whomever you're talking to, right? I mean, people tend to be by default fairly trusting because that's how they get through the world, right? And so if you kind of have a conversation with someone, even if you don't know them very well, you tend to trust them just to more often than not, right?
Mhm.
Which is a plus and a minus, right? And the same is true with a chatbot. I think people have a tendency to overlay a lot of sort of human elements on a chatbot, even though it's just a technology. And so they sort of treat it in a similar kind of way. And so they're wanting to trust, right? They want to do it. Um, and that's okay. And I think that that's sort of an advantage, I think, but you can spoil that by kind of, misusing the data potentially, right? And then once somebody decides that you're not trustworthy, that's it, right? They're never going to trust you again.
Right. It's hard. It's hard to win it back.
Yes, yes. Almost impossible, I think.
So today, the chatbots, like the LLMs, they've got their terms of service, like
Yeah.
most websites and social media services, for example. They seem pretty fixed around, we don't accept advertising. We don't sell your data for the purposes of advertising services. At least that's what OpenAI currently says. But I presume they can change those whenever they want. Like, how do you think about terms of service, the contract with the consumer, and
Yeah,
how
well,
how fixed are they, and should we not be naive around what could happen
well,
down the road?
so, what's great about internet businesses in general is that they're metered, right? So, the internet business knows what's going on, when people interact with it. And that's hugely powerful, right? So you put up, some feature, you see whether people actually use it, how they use it, gives you enormous amounts of information about how to improve things. It's part of the reason why the technology is so good. Same would, apply to a chat service, right? I'm sure that they monitor, what the questions are, what the responses are, whether this was a good response or a bad response. That feeds back into making their models better. It's probably the only real network effect that these chat engines have is, volume of data. And
Mhm.
that's just sort of par for the course for things that are on the internet. Is that a bad thing or a good thing? Is that what people expect? They probably aren't really totally conscious that, their responses are being used to make things better. And that's how a company would pitch it, I think, right? Would they be object to their data being used to make things better? If it's done in an aggregated way, probably not, right? I don't
Mhm.
know. There's no real reason to object to that, as long as it's not, it's again not being used for ad targeting or whatever it is, right? I think it gets kind of more questionable when that data gets used for something that wasn't, there was no permission. There was no permission. Typically around targeting for something else, some other
Right.
media.
So, well, that's sort of my question. If
Yeah,
they have all that data,
right.
historic. Let's fast forward 2 years from now, and
Yeah,
OpenAI wants ad revenue.
yeah.
They've used our data to make the service better. Presumably, they still have that data. If OpenAI changes its terms of service and now says we're going to use your data to deliver marketing services or advertising, can they go back and use all that data that they collected under a different sort of premise, or do they have to
Yeah.
sort of, how that works? I'm
Yeah,
just
I don't know the legality there. I mean, as to what applies to old data that's been like archived. I don't know whether they would bother because I mean, a service like ChatGPT, gathers so much data every day that they don't really need to go back to archives,
okay.
particularly if they're just gonna go forward. If that's what they decided what to do. Um, and would they do that? Well, probably if there's an ad product that gets sold on it in a chat interface, it probably will involve that, right?
Yeah, I mean,
That's my
of
guess.
course, they're going to do it. I mean, come on. I
Yeah.
mean, yeah,
Well, I mean, it's
if they need
likely.
the revenue, they're going to do it.
Yeah, it hasn't happened yet, but it's
No,
likely.
sure, yeah,
Yeah.
but it just takes one, right?
Right, right.
I
And then,
mean,
someone that's right. And there's a domino because
sure,
consumers have no place to go. They're going to get the ads. So,
yeah. So Jan, I'm pretty promiscuous with my data. The example I often use is I had lung cancer 3 years ago. Google probably knows I had lung cancer, or at least can, intuit that I had lung cancer, or at least maybe someone in my family did. But OpenAI knows everything about that cancer. They know the genetic type of it. I uploaded my scan reports. I uploaded my tumor report. Am I being too promiscuous? What's if you were my personal data privacy advisor, now that you're not working and you have time on your hands, if you were my personal data privacy advisor, what would you tell me? Should I be doing
no.
that or not?
Yeah, well, are you getting value from uploading all that data, right? So I know people have done this because, they want to get the second, professional medical opinion about their state. And that's super valuable to them. And the only way they're going to get that is by uploading that data, right? There isn't any other way, right?
Right.
And so I think that's a reasonable quid pro quo. Is there an expectation on your part that that data is not going to be used for something else? Yes, there is. And I think you would be terribly surprised if somehow or other, you felt like it was being used in some way that you didn't allow, right?
Yep.
And you'd be feel betrayed, probably should be, right? And so they probably won't do that, I don't think, right? Because for a company, trust is really important. I mean, if they lose trust, it's a terrible thing, terrible brand impact. It impacts their future earnings capability. So they won't go there, I don't think. And even as a targeting criteria for ads, is probably not all that great. I mean, maybe knowing that you've had some health issues might be, right? On the other hand, I listen to the evening news, and TV doesn't know anything about me, and I'm getting all these drug commercials all the time. I don't know.
Sure.
They have some concept of with the demographic that happens to be watching the show, right?
Yeah, I mean, my
Um,
point of view is I wouldn't mind getting served up quite frankly, relevant ads. I don't want to see random drug commercials that I have no interest in,
mm,
on the Golf Channel. Not that I watch the Golf Channel that much, but
I bet that's true, though.
but if GPT was serving up an ad that or information about frankly a trial, related to my disease, in my case the cancer, that kind of stuff's very valuable. I would love my AI to be paying attention for me, to
Yeah.
all
Well,
the
I mean, that's the kind
research
of the
and
good case of advertising where it comes
sure.
up and it's very relevant. And I think that's nice. But it's usually not like that, though.
But I want to zoom back out, ask you about this moment in time in terms of the acceleration of AI. And really, I want to sort of get past the deep seek sort of panic from a couple of weeks ago, and ask you about, do you think this is uh, a new industry, a new category where there's only one or two winners,
Hmm.
and there'll be big winners? I think that's more likely. Professor Scott Galloway, the founder of Section, is starting to suggest that that's not going to be the case with AI, and I think he's writing about this this week, and he's talking about it on the pods. That this might be like the airline industry, or some of the utility kind of categories, where it's great for the public good, but doesn't end up being great businesses. Great, the business
Yeah.
models are.
Yeah.
Yeah, what's your sense,
Well,
if you're an investor today?
yeah.
Would you bet on a couple of companies having 60,
Yes.
70% market share between them, and then everybody else fighting over the scraps? Or are you thinking this could be 10 or 20 players or more, sort of in
Yeah.
our everyday AI use?
Quick, I have a tendency to agree with Scott, I think, on this topic at the moment, right? With the way things seem to be shaking out. If you look at kind of, industries where things concentrate a lot, there's typically a reason why they do that, right? And it's almost never a technology reason. It's some kind of business reason, right? So the internet companies, which are dominant, are all marketplace companies. Like e-commerce is a marketplace. Google is a marketplace because of the ad marketplace.
Mm-hmm.
Marketplace companies tend to be natural monopolies because the biggest one tends to attract more users, more revenue, has more money, can invest more. Amazon is marketplace. E-commerce sites are all marketplaces, right? And that's a kind of a property of the way that the technology is being used. ChatGPT is not a marketplace, at least at the moment, right? It doesn't have a network effect. There's this minor network effect around collecting data. Is that
Mm-hmm.
enough to make it like super dominant over everything else that might try to do the same thing? Hasn't been true yet. There are like half a dozen alternative things you could go to, which are almost the same quality as ChatGPT, right? Which makes it a commodity, which is a strange thing because this is like a totally cutting edge technology, absolutely brand new, transformative, yet a commodity. Right.
Yeah, no, but there are some exceptions to your rule, right? If you think about Netflix or maybe Spotify, um, you
Well,
know,
but Netflix is also kind of a marketplace because the more, eyeballs they have, the more subscriber revenue, the more money they have to pay
yeah,
for,
yeah, yeah. I call that more scale than marketplace, but I hear you. I mean, it as it grows, it definitely locks others out. I mean, Meta, Facebook, and then
yes.
Instagram never really had any marketplace. That what they had is, I think,
Well, the ads are always a marketplace, right?
yeah,
Because
sure.
eyeballs. Yeah.
They had brand and growth. I don't know. I'm currently thinking, is this OpenAI's to lose, meaning that 80+%
Yeah.
market
Well, so, the way
80%
that
market
they become,
share.
yeah. it would become dominant. You can see that OpenAI is trying to hoover more stuff into the chat interface, right? So they've put in search, they're going to put in agents. It's going to be the one app that you can go to do everything. And if it becomes super convenient, then people will adopt it. The question is whether other people can, is there a moat that's preventing other people from doing that?
Yeah,
It's
no,
not
I get
obvious
it.
at the
Yeah.
moment, right?
Yeah, okay. Yeah, I don't know. To me, it's the Kleenex of the category.
Yeah, no, it is. It
If you
is.
ask an average consumer, you mention AI, they will think they'll say or think Chat GPT or GPT.
Yeah.
So I think
Yeah.
that
Right.
there,
But if you look at sort of some of the applications which are likely to generate value, which are, more vertical, specific to particular industries, and you're going to build off some base. I mean, the ChatGPT is not going to dominate that particularly. There are huge amounts of opportunities for other companies to enter that space and create a lot of value by doing something interesting in a vertical kind of way. So I think it's, ultimately really good for the consumer because the technology, there's this incredible deflation in the cost of the technology, which is great, which means it can be, way more widespread, used in more circumstances. And it really does lift up the user experience in a really significant way. And it allows you to do things that you couldn't do before. So, I think it's definitely gonna spread, but will it be just one company or a couple? I don't know. It doesn't seem like that.
I know you're a parent of a young adult. What is your advice for other parents in terms of coaching, if you will, or talking to their kids, let's say that are in sort of late high school or college, the workforce is not too far away in terms of their future.
Yeah.
What's your advice to these kids or
Well,
or the parents?
I mean, I've always felt, and certainly it was the way my parents brought me up, and the way we brought up our daughter Emily is, I really don't push her one way or the other. I let her do her thing, and just provide a really nurturing environment, and have good conversations with her, and you know, naturally she ends up doing something which I think is very reasonable. I'm not going to tell her that she should get a computer science degree, but she did. And she's done things which I think have been very good, and she's doing very well for herself, right?
Okay, that's kind of the point of my question. Would you tell her today to go get a computer science degree?
Well, not so explicitly. I think she observes what we do, and she understands, kind of what's going on in terms of what's going to make kind of a good sort of career path for her. But if she decided that she wanted to become a teacher, I'd be totally supportive of that. And I
Yeah,
think
no,
that,
I get that, but I guess I'm asking a different question, Jan. Is
yeah,
how do we think about
yeah.
should you change the path you're on, or if you're on a path at college to get whatever degree it is that you're going to get, should you just basically keep on that path and figure this out when you enter the workforce? AI will hit all these professions and industries at different rates with different impacts, and trying to game AI's impact and maybe go be a plumber instead. It's too early to do that.
Well, I think that's a great point. So AI is likely to make it possible for companies to make do with a lot less people, I think, because a lot of routine things will be automatable. Right? And so, if you're going to end up in a job or a job category which is easily automatable, you probably should think about that and be, have you know, get your, how to say, become aware of what AI does, maximize your productivity. Don't make yourself a target, I think, by, doing something which is, clearly, I mean, the boogie whip maker, I guess, is sort of the
Sure. Yeah,
analogy.
yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah, no, I agree. Listen, if my kids are on,
Yeah,
here's my advice. I've got 3 adult kids. Be in the top quartile of your class. What I mean by that is class at work. Whatever team you're on at work,
yeah.
don't screw around and be in the top quarter. That's how I'd answer the question. Great conversation. This is our second one that we've had, so I appreciate you for coming on. I want to appreciate the audience. You are showing up, and by doing that, you are, I think, focused. You're investing in yourself, and I just think you need to be acknowledged for that. We are in this moment of such change, such opportunity, and I think some not insignificant risk. as well, as AI kind of hits our society, hits our companies, hits our teams. So I just want to acknowledge and appreciate you for doing that. Your head is not in the sand. Your head's up, your shoulders are square, and you're looking at AI straight in the eyes.